$877 billion, that is what Apple has spent buying back its own stock across Tim Cook's 15 years as chief executive. Tonight, after the bell, earnings from Apple, Amazon, NVIDIA and Occidental reshaped how we read the megacap numbers. Apple's June quarter, Cook's final earnings call as CEO, delivered record revenue of $109.4 billion, up 16% year-over-year. Net income landed at $29.8 billion, and Apple returned roughly $29.8 billion to shareholders in the same quarter, matching earnings dollar for dollar. About $25.8 billion of that came from buybacks and $4.0 billion from dividends. The 9-month buyback total now sits at $62.1 billion. Across Cook's tenure, diluted share count has fallen about 43%, from roughly 26 billion shares to 14.75 billion. But the math has shifted. At today's roughly $235 per share, each buyback dollar buys fewer shares than at any earlier point in his run. That is the paradox. Cook hands his successor. The buyback engine worked so well that it now costs more to keep working. For a stock still repurchasing its own shares, that means each future dollar will do less lifting per share. Amazon printed a record Q2 as well, revenue of $200.6 billion, up 20% year-over-year. The engine was AWS, which accelerated to $42.2 billion, up 37%, its fastest growth in 18 quarters. AWS operating margin came in around 39.3%, a striking print for a cloud unit at this scale. GAAP net income totaled $62.6 billion, but the composition matters more than the headline. Roughly $41 billion of that was after-tax non-operating investment gains, primarily on Amazon's stake in Anthropic. The actual operating businesses contributed about $21 billion after tax. And trailing 12-month free cash flow has flipped to negative $7.6 billion as CapEx on AI infrastructure runs ahead of the operating engine. Read together, the earnings headline is a blowout, but the cash cycle is still spending faster than it earns. NVIDIA's Q1 FY27 tells a similar story of headline numbers inflated by investment marks rather than by the core chip line. Pre-tax income totaled $69.9 billion, of which $15.9 billion, or 22.8%, came from the other income line. The filing pins almost all of that year-over-year swing on unrealized marks. $13.4 billion on publicly held equity securities and $2.6 billion on non-marketable stakes, accounting gains, not operating cash. GAAP EPS came in at $2.39 versus non-GAAP EPS of $1.87. Net income roughly tripled, but the underlying chip business, on its own, did not. Occidental Petroleum delivered adjusted EPS of $2.40, up 823% year-over-year, beating the $1.92 consensus by 25%. Continuing operations revenue came in at $8.33 billion for the quarter. 7 years after the Anadarko acquisition, principal debt is down to $11.8 billion, the lowest since mid-2019. That is a roughly 70% cut from the post-Anadarko peak near $40 billion. The lever was OxyChem, sold to Berkshire Hathaway for $9.7 billion and closed in January. OXY also posted about $3 billion of free cash flow in a single quarter. Union Pacific bought back exactly 0 shares in the first half of 2026. A year earlier it had repurchased 11.86 million shares for $2.68 billion. The railroad is deliberately hoarding cash for roughly $20 billion owed to Norfolk Southern shareholders in its planned combination. Quick hit, S&P Global revenue rose 10.4% to $4.15 billion and adjusted EPS jumped 23.2% to $4.83, with ratings alone printing $1.34 billion. Apollo research this month found AI is suppressing wages, not employment. Real wage growth for high-exposure workers ran 6.7 points below peers since 2023. Apollo estimates that shows up as roughly $28 billion in annual pay shortfall across about 5.8 million high-exposure workers. And Phillips Securities cut Airbnb to reduce this month while raising its target to $158. The stock has set two 52-week highs since. Watch item, August 26. After the close, Salesforce and NVIDIA report the same evening. A rare simultaneous read on AI software monetization and AI infrastructure demand, with Agentforce billing facing its first real test. For full breakdowns of every number in tonight's episode, head to LineVestNews.com and get LineVest daily in your inbox each morning before the US Open.